said unto her, Weep not.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see each and every one of you. We're always thankful for the opportunities we have to worship God in spirit and truth. Certainly thankful for another opportunity to open up God's Word and learn a lesson from it and try to apply it to our lives so we can become better Christians. The book of the month has been Luke, and we've looked at one lesson on the mission begins. Jesus kind of goes back to his hometown. He goes back to the synagogue. He quotes from Isaiah, and he says the time is now. And he rattles off a whole bunch of things that he is fulfilling, that he's going to be preaching the gospel, that he's going to be healing, and that he is also going to be freeing individuals, and certainly Jesus is going to do all of that. Last week we looked at the idea that Jesus was a true friend, and that might not be what people would expect in our world today, but a true friend is certainly going to go out on a limb and certainly tell people the truth and have some conversations, certainly care and be considerate. But another thing that I think I pick up through the Gospels and through the book of Luke is that Jesus certainly had compassion. And that's what I would like to discuss and consider in our own lives this evening. If you open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through about 17 there, we're going to look at one situation in particular that Jesus is involved in. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Jesus is actually going to see a funeral. You've probably seen a funeral many times, a funeral procession. You see the cars lined up and driving to a cemetery of some type. You've seen a procession of some type. That's what Jesus runs into walking into this town. And just trying to get into the situation, we'll probably read all the verses and then kind of come back and reflect on Jesus and his interactions here. In verse 11 it says, Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Do not weep. Then he came and touched and opened the coffin. Those who carried him stood still, and he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, The prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him went throughout all of Judea and all the surrounding region. You know, you think of this situation that unfolds. You know, you've got people walking by in this funeral procession. Jesus, he's going to be concerned. And he's going to help in miraculous ways. But certainly I think the principles can apply. Is that we can stop, we can be concerned. You know, you think about Jesus' schedule and how busy he was and the mission that he had. But I think this definitely fell under Jesus' mission in many respects, as we see that Jesus was very loving and compassionate, and he was willing to stop, even though he had a busy schedule. He had many things to do. I'm sure he had many plans for this town, but he gets there, and there's something there that causes him to stop. And many times I think we have to ask ourselves that question, is how often do we stop for those that are around us? I think that's a principle that has to be applied when it comes to compassion, is you got to stop. Jesus stopped. In fact, he's going to stop the whole funeral procession there. He's going to stop. He's going to get engaged. He's going to talk to the widow there, and he's going to care. He's going to be concerned. He's going to say, don't weep, and he's going to get engaged in this situation. How many situations do we walk by in our lives that we could help, that we could show compassion? You know, it might be good to define compassion. There's a lot of definitions out there, but compassion is a deep, heartfelt sympathy that leads to action. See, it's one thing to feel sorry for somebody. It's another thing to stop and be concerned and try to help in some way. But really, when we're thinking about compassion, it's a heartfelt sympathy that leads us to action. And we see that happened in Jesus' life frequently. This is not the first time Jesus is going to stop, and it's not going to be the last time that Jesus is going to stop. I think it's significant that Jesus stopped. This is not the first time, it's not the last time, and perhaps you could argue one of the biggest hurdles in our life when it comes to compassion is just stopping. Just slowing down. In someone else's life that we can help and we can assist in some way. And perhaps we have more opportunities than we care to admit. But what happens is we get blinded by our own schedule, our own responsibilities, our own obligations, and we can't see the pain and the suffering that is right next door. Jesus is going into this town. He's got a mission, but he sees this and he's got to stop. Will you stop? You know, I think that's just an idea in itself to consider. Jesus didn't just the in a fast-paced world of Jesus life and to stop. How often do we rush past our own plans? And I think this is powerful when it comes to Jesus. This is not the first time. This is not the last matter. Jesus is that when Jesus would see a situation of human suffering, he'd stop and say, "What can I do?" And that might not have been verbalized. You can see his actions. We see it in this situation. At a funeral, Jesus stopped. There are so many times when you start actually looking for that throughout the Gospels, you'll find it happened more often than not. When Jesus came in contact with human suffering, when human suffering came to Jesus' attention, he almost stopped every single time. Almost every single time he stopped. It's not that Jesus wasn't busy. It wasn't that he didn't have priorities. This was a priority, that other individuals were important and they were worth stopping for. You're going to have opportunities in your life to pause. When someone around you is hurting, and don't rush away. Perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges in our life from time to time, is just slowing down so we can help. Just slowing down so we can be concerned. Just slowing down so we can offer a helping hand or a shoulder to cry on. Can we put the phone down and give someone your full attention? Can we say, "I have time, what's going on?" Jesus stopped this funeral procession. But there's other times that Jesus stopped. In Mark chapter 10, there's a blind man named Bartimaeus. And he actually yells out to God multiple times. He's just yelling out to God, yelling out to God, yelling out to God. He's yelling out to Jesus, and we see that the people around him say, "Be quiet, don't bother Jesus. Don't bother Jesus." And you know what? Jesus stops. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 32 through 34, we see that Jesus stopped for two blind men. He stopped. I'm sure he had things on his schedule. I'm sure he had things to do. But when Jesus came in contact with human suffering, he had a tendency, and that tendency and help and assist in the way that he could. In fact, this is Luke chapter 7. If we just go over to Luke chapter 8, in Luke chapter 8, we have another situation. There are many situations that we can find. But Luke chapter 44 through 48. Turned to the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered her house. With her hair. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has feet. Since the time I came in, did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins," I'm in the wrong chapter here. I'm in chapter 7. but certainly is significant. Chapter 8 and verse 44, rather, Jesus pauses and speaks to a woman that touches his garment. We remember this woman, she's just crawling up and she just barely touches his garment in chapter 8, verses 44 and following, to touch that garment, and Jesus is going to stop. In Mark chapter 5, he stops for a woman that has an issue with her blood. This is not uncommon. And you read through the Gospels, you're going to see that Jesus, when he came in contact with human suffering, he was willing to stop. And I think we have to be willing to stop as well. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4, it says, "Look not only to your own interest, but also the interest of others." There are many people in my life that I think have developed their compassion, that have developed the ability to stop. And I really don't think that this is really a schedule issue, it's a priority issue many times. I think my dad has had a gift at this, and I don't know if it was kind of natural or it's just been cultivated over the years. My dad works at WP, he's a vice president. He knows every single janitor there. He knows every security member there. In fact, I was just talking to him the other day, and I said, hey, I saw a security guard walking. I said, we haven't had a security guard that's kind of walked the premises like that. A lot of times they'll drive the car around, which is great, and they're doing a good job. But there's this one guy who just walks. And I mentioned it to my dad. You know what my dad did immediately? He pulled out his phone, he made a note, and he says, I'm going to thank him tomorrow. My dad, he shows up early, he stays late. That's just my dad. He knows all those janitors. He thanks them. He tries to say happy birthday when it's their birthday. He's very good at that. You know, there's some people that have almost a natural knack for compassion, a natural knack for stopping their lives. And I think he's one of those. And I think we have people here at Sandyville that are very good at that. They see the human suffering. They see the problem. They see the issue, and they say, we got to stop. Yeah, we got all this on our schedule. We got all this on the calendar, but we got to stop. I mean, this is something that is worth stopping for. And you know what? A congregation that stops in those situations will make a difference in people's lives. It's time to stop. He saw this funeral procession, and he knew. He said, I got to stop. I got to stop. Sometimes we've got to stop. Real compassion begins when we're willing to stop our busy lives for someone else's pain. And that's not always easy to do. In fact, that's a rare thing to find many times, somebody that's just willing to stop. And I think we can all do better as we reflect. I've told this story before, but my father, he was skipping school, which was probably a little bit uncommon for him, but he was skipping school. And the principal just happened to be driving by, and he was seeing my dad about to go over the hill. Really, my dad was a little bit away from the school. You know, the principal probably could have just drove on by and said, you know what, my responsibility really is the kids at the school, not the kid running over the hill and getting out of school today. But you know what, he stopped and he yelled up that hill, and he got my dad to come down, and he had a conversation with my dad. He was willing to stop. And we need more people in our lives that are willing to stop. And really, when we look at ourselves, we need to be a person that's willing to stop, just as Jesus did. Real compassion begins when we're willing to stop our busy lives for someone else's pain. How many times are we going to drive by? Jesus could have walked by, could he not? He's a busy man. He's got a lot to do. He's got a lot of preaching to do. He's got a lot on his schedule. He knew he needed to stop, and sometimes we've got to stop. And that's many times where compassion starts. It starts with us stopping. Not only did Jesus stop, but we see in chapter 7 there, in verse 13, we see that he doesn't just stop. He is genuinely concerned about this widow. In chapter 7 and verse 13, he kind of stops everything. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, said to her, do not weep. He not only stopped, but he was concerned and he had care for this situation. And really, I think it's kind of ironic, but so many times I have read over this passage and I haven't really stopped to consider it. But when I really stopped and I thought about it, what was all going through Jesus' mind when he starts to have this heartfelt conversation with this widow? Did he think to himself, this widow does not have a husband? Not only does she not have a husband, but now she has lost her only son. Talk about a hard situation. A hard situation that Jesus was willing to stop for and get engaged in and say, do not weep, and he's getting engaged. He wants to help. He's genuinely concerned. So not only stopping, but having a genuine concern. Jesus had a genuine concern for this widow who had no husband and now no son. We're going to have opportunities in our lives to listen without interrupting or trying to fix things. I have a bad habit of that. I want to fix about everything. Sometimes I'll be meeting with somebody, I'll be talking to them, and I'll be thinking about a prayer that we could have in relation to the situation. My mind will be going all these different places, and sometimes I just got to listen. But I try to jump in and try to fix everything. I'm really bad with Sarah. I try to fix everything. Oh, man. I try to fix everything, and I have a trouble sometimes just listening. Jesus is willing to stop. He's willing to have care and concern. He's willing to say, I'm here for you. And I think he's sending a message that I'm here to help. Does Jesus not already know everything about the situation? I think he does, but I think him just inserting these few words and just stopping shows that he is invested and he's caring and he wants to help. In James chapter 1 and verse 19, it says, be quick to hear and slow to speak. And sometimes we need that when we are trying to be concerned and help someone. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 15, it tells us to weep with those who weep. And you know what? I kind of see that with Jesus. When Jesus saw that situation of human suffering, he says, I'm going to stop. I'm going to be concerned. I'm going to get engaged in this. Weep with those who weep. In Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 4, it says, a word that sustains the weary. In Proverbs 18 and verse 13, it says, to answer before listening is folly and shame. I've got myself into trouble a lot of times by doing that. In Proverbs 18 and verse 13, it says, to answer before listening, that's folly and shame. Have you ever started to have a conversation with somebody before you listened? And you're like, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that. Why did I say that? Why didn't I just listen and gather all the information about the situation before I said something like that? Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13, to answer before listening, that's folly and shame. Jesus had compassion. There's no doubt about it. To stop is one thing, but to be concerned and care is another thing on top of it. And I think we see that with Jesus, is he genuinely cared and was concerned. And there are many times in the Bible where we look and we read, we see that he stopped, he cared and was concerned. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, it says, he was moved with compassion for them. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, it says, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. Do we stop? Are we concerned? If we stop and we're concerned, we're far more likely to act. It's like a parent who hears their child cry at night. You hear that cry. You're moved by that cry to get up even though it's not convenient. You're in that bed, you're tired, it's early in the morning or in the middle of the night and you hear that cry and you get up. You go, you stop, you care, you concern. You think of a shepherd counting the sheep. And the shepherd counts the sheep, and when the shepherd realizes one's missing, what does the shepherd do? The shepherd goes and tries to find that sheep. It's one thing to stop and count. It's another thing to know that the sheep is missing. And then it's another thing to try to go and get that sheep. And that is compassion, is that we see the problem, we see the issue, we're concerned, and we try to reach out and we try to act on their behalf to help. Compassion many times is listening first. And sometimes silence speaks louder than our advice. We see Jesus here, he stops. We see Jesus here, he's concerned, and he gets engaged with this widow. And we see that Jesus is going to help. In verses 14 and 15, it says, "Then he came and touched the open coffin." He touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. I understand that we don't have the miraculous, but Jesus stopped. He was concerned about the situation, and then Jesus, I think, had this kind of, how can I help? How can I assist? And Jesus, with his miraculous ability, certainly helps and assists. But many times, we will be able to help and assist as well, maybe not miraculously, but with our words and with our deeds. Can you cook a meal or help someone, run errands for someone grieving or sick? Can you offer a ride or child care or time to someone under stress? Be the person who shows up when others won't. See, compassion is one of those ideas that I think we can understand. But it's one of those ideas, like so many in the Bible, sometimes it's hard to apply. Because in order to have compassion, you're going to have to stop. You're going to have to be genuinely concerned, and you are going to have to extend that helpful hand. And certainly I think that's what the Bible wants us to do, is have a community of believers that have compassion. A community of believers that are willing to stop for one another. A community of believers that are concerned with one another genuinely. A community of believers that are willing to help each other. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, it says, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." In 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, it says, "Let us not love with words, but with our actions," really. "In deed and in truth," is what it says. In deed and in truth. I remember that judgment scene in Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew chapter 25, we have the splitting of the people, and the people are being divided on the judgment day. And these people say, "Well, why are we over here? And why are we over here?" And there are many things that are said. But some of the people that are actually on the right side, they kind of have some questions as well. And Jesus was just very simple. He says, "I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat." And when you read through Matthew chapter 25, it is very clear. And I think everything you read in Matthew chapter 25, when you look at being hungry, visiting, all these things are things of compassion. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was in prison, and you visited me. All these are acts of compassion. Seeing somebody suffering, stopping, being concerned, and offering some help and assistance. I was running some errands for Sarah, and you don't always say the perfect things, and honestly, I didn't even think of what to say in this situation. But I was running some errands for Sarah. I saw somebody that needs some help, so I just thought, I better help them. Well, I started to help them, and they were kind of saying, no, don't help me. I said, no, it's fine. It's not a big deal. I'll help you. And after I got kind of done helping them, they said, "Why did you help me?" You know what? I wish I would have had a better answer there in the time. Not that this was a bad answer, but I just said, I hope that if something happens to me, that somebody would do this for my wife. Which is really the golden rule when you think about it, It's like if I saw a woman in that type of situation needing some assistance, I would hope someone would help Sarah. So I didn't think of anything. I just went and helped her. And she said, "Why'd you help me?" And I just said, well, if my wife was in a similar situation, I would hope that somebody would do something similar for her. Compassion, see the problem, feel the problem, stop, care, and help. And I don't know if it's one of those complicated things in the Bible, but what happens is Satan, but also just our life in general is, and I think this has happened in the United States, is that slowly but surely I think we have become more and more selfish. That we have become more and more so focused on ourselves. And maybe it's because of our prosperity and because of our wealth is like, hey, I can take care of myself and myself's taken care of, so I don't need to think about anybody else. But when I look at Jesus, Jesus was concerned about other people. If he saw a situation of suffering, it is like almost automatic. He said, I'm going to stop, I'm going to be concerned, I'm going to help. And it's not a one-time thing. We see it over and over again. And if we're going to model the compassion of Jesus, when we see human suffering, we have to say, I got to stop. I got to be concerned. I've got to help. And do we not see this in any better of a situation than Luke chapter 10? In Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember the Good Samaritan? We have this guy that's on the side of the road, and he's been beat up, and everything's been taken, and what does that guy do? We see the Good Samaritan is going to stop, be concerned, and help. But you know what happens in that parable? Is many people walk on by. And some of these people are people that you would expect would stop and assist, but they don't. In Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 27, it says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act." Don't withhold good when it's in your power to do it, when you have the ability to do those things. But if you remember Luke chapter 10, with the parable of the Good Samaritan, I just want to read verse 33 there and verse 34. It says, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.'" Jesus stopped, he cared, he helped. And when we look at the Good Samaritan, it's the same pattern. He stopped, he was genuinely concerned, and he helped. That's compassion. Can we really say we have compassion when these situations come into our lives and we do nothing? I tell you, James chapter 2, verses 15 and 16 are pretty powerful in the other respect. It says, "If a brother or a sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit?" Jesus clearly was involved in compassion. Will we stop? Will we be concerned? Will we help? You know, that is the real trick, I think, in our lives. As we get so busy and we have so many things going on in our own life, we get so focused on ourselves that we have to look out into the world and say, where is there human suffering? Where is there human suffering? Where are people going through hard times that are close to me? Sometimes they're not even that far away. Sometimes they're right next door. Will we stop? Will we care? Will we offer a helping hand? You know, there's a book. It's called Unreasonable Hospitality. It's an interesting book. And really, when I read the Bible, I think that's almost what we have to be. We almost have to be hospitable to the point that people say no, you know. Let them say no twice. Let them say no 3 times. I'm going to help you anyway. I'm going to try to assist you any way that I can. I'm going to try to extend that helping hand because that's the compassion of Jesus. And I can tell you that is very hard to duplicate. And that would make us shine like a shining light because people don't do that type of stuff anymore. Make people meals, write people cards, stop, help, assist, take out some time. You know, sometimes I don't think we realize the impression we make on people. I remember I was taking a meal to somebody. I don't want to say where it was, but I took the meal and some of the in-laws were there when I was dropping some stuff off. I think it left an impression. Some people dropped a meal off at my house, which I'm not asking for it. That's not what I'm at. I think it left an impression on my in-laws. Unreasonable hospitality, unreasonable compassion. Jesus, why are you stopping? Because I care. Jesus, don't stop for that guy. He's just yelling out. No, Jesus, stop. We've got to be willing to stop. And when we do, we can reflect Jesus Christ and we can be something special. We can be something special for the people around us, and we can be something special in this world to be the light that Christ wants us to be. Jesus had compassion, there's no doubt. The question is will we have the type of compassion that Jesus had? Perhaps you need to become a New Testament Christian. Perhaps you need the prayers of the church. We'd love to help you in any way that we can if you come as we stand, as we sing.